Welcome to this evening with Judge Richard Posner, part of the Democracy Forum lecture series at Elmhurst College. This lecture has been selected to be recorded for Chicago Amplified, an online program produced by WBEZ Chicago that captures some of the most exciting and innovative cultural programming in the Chicago area. In your printed program, you'll find out how you can hear this lecture again or share it with others through Chicago Amplified. A video of tonight's lecture also will be available. Please refer to your program for the web address. At this time, I'd like to ask that you make sure your cell phones are turned off. And now it's my pleasure to introduce to you the president of Elmhurst College, Dr. S. Allen Ray. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. As president of Elmhurst College, I have the privilege and the honor to welcome you to the annual Rudolph G. Schoddy Lecture and to provide a little historical background on the lecture series itself. The Reverend Dr. Rudolph G. Schoddy had intended to stay only briefly at Elmhurst College, but instead enjoyed a career here that exceeded 3 decades. He's remembered as representing the very best of what it means to be a teacher. Born in Germany, the teacher, historian, and minister came to the college in 1946 at the urging of Reinhold Niebuhr, a 1910 graduate of Elmhurst. Along with history, Dr. Schoddy taught Greek and philosophy. His style of teaching earned him legendary status among his students, many of whom became lifelong friends. During homecoming of 1984, an event dedicated to Professor Schoddy, an endowed lecture fund was established in his honor by 3 former students and was supported by alumni, friends, colleagues, and churches. The college has brought many renowned speakers to campus to present this lecture in honor of Professor Schoddy, and tonight we are pleased to welcome the Honorable Richard A. Posner. At this time, I ask that Judge William J. Bauer of the United States Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals, member of the Elmhurst College class of 1949 and a college trustee, please come forward to introduce our speaker this evening. Thank you.
The man I'm about to introduce, I have served with for the last 31 years on the United States Court of Appeals for the Seventh Circuit. For those of you who are geographically challenged, the Seventh Circuit encompasses Illinois, Indiana, and Wisconsin. The man I'm going to introduce is a member of the bar of none of those 3 states. He is, however, a member of the bar of the New York state. He may be the smartest man I've ever met in my life, present company accepted, of course. He has written over 40 books, about 26 of them or 27 of them in the last 31 years. I tried to get them all, but I ran out of space in my limited library. He graduated from Yale. Well, he grew up in New York, both in the city and in Scarsdale. Went to Yale undergraduate school and then Harvard Law School, where he was president of the Law Review and first in his class and class valedictorian. He graduated summa cum laude and then clerked for William Brennan of the Supreme Court of the United States, who, by the way, was the head of the liberal wing of the court. Judge Posner, however, was the first appointee to our court by Judge Reagan, our President Reagan. There's so, judges and presidents get mixed up with one has to run for office and the other doesn't. That's the thing. I've run for office 3 times, been appointed 3 times. It's easier to be appointed. You may take my word for it. But I can tell you that Justice Brennan told me that one of the only 2 men he ever met in his life was a genius, included Dick. Having said that, I like to add that he's also a very nice man, and I get along with him very, very well. He does not suffer fools gladly, and that makes me happy because he doesn't hit me often. one of the things people don't know about how judges work on a court of appeals, we sit in panels of 3. And I will sit and he will sit with the other judges the same number of times in every 15 months or so, because they're drawn at random electronically. We are not prefixed. And so I'm with them as much as anybody else in that court. We discuss the cases, we discuss our points of view, and then we get the cases assigned, and each day we sit, when here are 6 cases, we will draw 2 apiece to draft the opinion on them. Obviously, you have to have somebody with you, one of the 2 with you, or you haven't got a majority opinion. What is interesting about Dick, after we finish discussing the case, if you have concerns about it, he is easy to talk to. He is usually right enough so you don't have to worry about whether you'll change your mind. He'll change your mind for you. And he's done that many times with me. He has written on any subject you can name. There are some examples in that handout you got, but my favorite is Sex and the Law. It sold like hotcakes. So did Margaret Mead's Sex Life in Samoa. And the readers in that book were as disappointed as the ones that read the textbook. It was not pornographic. It was a straight discussion of law and its sexual impact back and forth. I use it as an example of a road to celibacy, so it's available to you. He's also written on how judges think. That was one of his more important books, and I'm glad I read it because now I know why I do what I do and how I think that way. He is the most cited judge in America. Law schools have a whole law school section or class that's devoted just to what he has written in law. He has written hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of opinions on hundreds and hundreds of subjects. He is a thoughtful, decent man, and what he's going to talk to us about tonight, as far as I can tell, and I always hesitate to speak for him, is what's wrong with the world at large and our political system at best. To those of you who want to pinpoint him in a political one, said, you're going to have a hard time. I still don't know what he is. I gather he is an independent. And so I'd like to introduce to you one of my dear friends, my close colleagues, and one of the men I admire very, very much, Richard Posner.
Thank you very much, Judge Brower. That was a very generous introduction, and the problem with a generous introduction, it raises expectations about the speaker, which are quickly shattered when he starts to speak, but I'm really grateful for that. And I'm very grateful to President Ray for inviting me to give the talk, and to the Shada family. I'll tell one anecdote about Judge Brower, since he mentioned my book, Sex and Reason. I gave a little talk to a group about the book, and Judge Brower was there. And at the end of my talk, he said to me very sarcastically, "Wow, I'm going to have to go home and take a cold shower now." So what I'm going to talk about is capitalism, our economic system, and democracy, our political system, and their interrelations, and the problems that both of these systems are experiencing at the moment. And I want to start by saying something about the recent and still present economic crisis of the country. So we have a short-term problem with our economic system and a long-term problem. And similarly, we have short-term and long-term problems with our political system. So those will be the framework for my analysis. It's very important to understand what exactly happened that caused this unusually deep recession. I wouldn't call it a recession, I would call it a depression because of the length that it has troubled us and because of the political and other consequences that it has had. It's the most serious economic crisis the country has experienced since the 1930s, and so it deserves to be called a depression and not just another recession. And what happened, I think now we understand what happened. What happened was that in about 2000, the then head of the Federal Reserve System, Alan Greenspan, became very worried about the possibility of deflation. We don't think much about deflation. Deflation means falling prices, and you might think that that would be great, but actually deflation is extremely sinister because what happens is that if prices start to fall, people expect them to continue to fall, so they don't buy. They wait for prices to fall farther. And actually, at the beginning of our current crisis, in the fall of 2008, there was a momentary fear of deflation. I remember talking to one of my law clerks, and I mentioned that I had gone to Brooks Brothers and bought a suit, and it had been 25% off. And I said I'd never seen such a bargain at Brooks Brothers. So he said to me that, well, he was going to wait a few months and it was going to be 50% off. So when you start having thinking like that, the whole economy can spiral into a very low level of production because people are waiting for prices to fall. So deflation is dangerous. Greenspan, fearing deflation, used the powers of the Federal Reserve to reduce interest rates. And it's really very straightforward how this is done. The Federal Reserve simply creates large balances on its books in favor of the banks that it regulates. These banks now have more money, so they lend more. The more that's loaned, the lower interest rates are, and so people borrow more, and they have more money now, more disposable income, so they buy things. And as consumption rises, production rises, and so employment rises. So that's the idea of using low interest rates to stimulate economic growth. And that's what he did in the early 2000s. The reason for it was that at the very end of the 1990s, there had been a serious stock market crash in dot-com firms. And he was worried that this was going to set off a general economic drop, which, as I say, would involve deflation and could be very, very dangerous. So he lowered interest rates. But the problem was he lowered them very, very steeply, and he kept them down for years. And that turned out to have very, very serious consequences. The reason is that when interest rates are very low, this has a potentially very great impact on the housing market. The reason is that houses are a product that's bought with debt. So the standard mortgage is an 80% mortgage, so it means you're paying 80% of the price of the house with a loan that you've taken out. And the lower the interest rate, the cheaper the loan, and hence the more you're willing to pay for the house. And so if interest rates are very, very low, especially long-term interest rates, then houses are going to look like a very attractive investment, inexpensive investment. Housing prices will rise because people can finance them at very low rates. So housing prices, which had already been rising in the 1990s, now took off in the early 2000s. As housing prices rose, people began to save less money. And the reason is that they figured, well, their price, the value of their house is rising, That's a form of savings. So we don't have to save because our net worth is increasing because we have this great housing asset. So you have rising housing prices, a saving rate falling to virtually zero in around 2005. And at some point, the rise in housing prices is so steep that we have a bubble phenomenon where people start buying houses because they think that with housing prices rising, it's a terrific investment. People start flipping houses. Buy a house, maybe you own one house, you live in the house, now you buy another house in the expectation of selling it in just a few months and making a profit. So tremendous speculation in the housing market, rising prices, people feeling great, they're feeling rich, they have this great asset, they don't have to save money. This bubble was suspected by some people. The Economist magazine in England, for example, said there was a housing bubble in the United States and would burst. And there were some economists in the United States who said that. But the general view, including the view of Greenspan and the view of Bernanke, who's now the head of the Federal Reserve but had a different position in the earlier 2000s, they said no, not a bubble, it was fundamentals that were driving up prices, and prices would continue to, if not continue rising, at least they'd be stable, and it was a great investment, and so on. So, but it was a bubble, and eventually it burst. And what happens is people find they have this house, they bought it because there was so much excitement about housing, so much demand for houses. The banking companies were experimenting with new forms of loan. And one that was a favorite loan was a 100% loan where you didn't have to put down a down payment. And you paid a low interest rate for a couple of years, but then it was going to increase. But then what the mortgage brokers would tell you is, well, because housing prices are rising, in a few years you'll have equity. Your house will be worth more than your 100% loan. Then it'll be a 90% loan. And you'll be able to refinance, get a conventional mortgage at a low interest rate. If you couldn't do that, then you'd have to pay an automatic increase in your interest rate because of the riskiness of your loan. So when house prices first stopped rising and started dropping, people found themselves unable to refinance their home, unable to afford the reset mortgage, so now people begin selling houses and prices begin spiraling down. And this in turn is very troublesome for the banks because they've lent all this money on mortgages, 100% mortgages and so on. They can't afford to have housing values fall to the point where people start walking away from their houses because the mortgage is worth more than the house. And so the banks get in trouble, and it's complicated by the way in which they had securitized the mortgages and sold the mortgages and bought securitized mortgages. And so in the fall of 2008, there was just a tremendous collapse. First of housing prices, well actually it started earlier, and now the housing prices bringing down the banks. Credit freezing. And of course the system, the whole world economic system runs on credit, and when banks start going broke or they're afraid to lend because everyone seems to be in financial trouble, then you have a freezing of the economic system, and that happened. And businesses began reducing their production and laying off workers, and consumers getting very nervous because now they have overvalued houses, and they don't have liquid savings. They've been dissaving for years, so they're very anxious. They freeze. They stop buying, and producers stop selling and stop employing, And at the end of 2008, the beginning of 2009, the economy was spiraling downward at actually a more rapid rate than following the 1929 stock market crash that ushered in the Great Depression. So this was a real crisis when the administration changed in January 2009. Now, in a situation like this, there is a standard solution in economics, which is if you have the private sector kind of frozen, people are afraid to buy, interest rates very, very low, but no one is borrowing because they can't afford to take on additional debt. They're over indebted as there is, and banks are afraid to lend because they're afraid that people are insolvent, not be able to repay. Then the solution is for the government, which can borrow very cheaply, to borrow a lot of money and use it to try to restart economic activity with projects, for example. So one of the first industries to be hit by this downturn at the end of 2008 was the construction industry, because, of course, most construction can be postponed. So with the economy now in a nervous state, road building projects, home building projects, obviously, the surplus supply of housing froze, and the construction companies laid off the construction workers. So soon you had 600,000 unemployed construction workers. So the standard solution, the Keynesian deficit spending antidote to a depression, would be for the government to finance a bunch of construction projects, roads and insulating houses and painting schools and what have you. And this would result in rehiring the construction workers, and they'd be getting a salary, they'd feel better, the unemployment rate would fall, people would become more confident, be more willing to borrow money and to spend money on consumer items. So that was the plan, and Congress in February 2009 did authorize about $800 billion of government borrowing to finance projects designed to stimulate economic growth. Unfortunately, it wasn't a very well-designed plan. It wasn't well administered, wasn't well executed. And in particular, it turned out, difference between the 1930s and today, in 1933, when Roosevelt became president, and began to launch public works projects to absorb the millions of unemployed people, within months, government agencies had been created, new government agencies, Works Progress Administration, Civilian Conservation Corps. These agencies were not only created, but they had hired literally millions of people. They weren't doing much, but they were, cleaning streets and so on, painting buildings. But the people were employed, and they were getting a salary, and they were feeling better, and the economy began a rapid increase. It was later interrupted, but the early period of the new administration was one of very, very rapid employment growth and economic growth generally. But nowadays, there's so many permit requirements and so much bureaucracy in doing anything that although this stimulus, this deficit spending statute was enacted in February 2009, it took months, some cases years, before the money could actually be dispersed on projects. And so the economic revival was very sluggish. There was a dramatic and successful expenditure, and that was the auto bailout in 2009. The automobile companies, well, two of them, General Motors and Chrysler, were facing actual liquidation, not just bankruptcy where you're operated by a trustee, but you're still making cars. No, it was going to be liquidation. They were going to close their plants. And there would have been several 100,000 unemployed auto workers, but in addition, the employees of all the satellite companies that supply parts to the automobile manufacturers and also the dealers, they would be out of business, and there might be 1 million unemployed all of a sudden. So the government saved the industry with huge investment, and that was probably very good. So, so by the middle of 2009, the economy had recovered to a degree, but unemployment was high, and economic growth was slow, and the housing industry very, very depressed. And that's 3 years ago, and there has been some improvement in the economy, but it has not been dramatic. And there are a variety of reasons for that. Apparently, the stimulus program of February 2009, $800 billion, that's actually only a very small fraction of the gross domestic product of the United States, which is about $14 trillion a year. So, so 800 billion is about, I guess, 6%. 1% would be 140 billion. So, yeah, about 5 or 6%. So that's a significant injection of money into the economy, but not enough to make really dramatic short-term changes, especially since the money wasn't spent at once, but because of these, permit requirements and so on, it was spread over about 3 years. So, so it's probably too small. It was spent in too sluggish a fashion, and it wasn't terribly effective. Probably the healthcare program of the administration probably impeded economic recovery. The reason being that it is very, very complicated. Is very complicated, with a great deal of the actual consequences depending on regulations that would be made by various government agencies. And it was difficult for businesses, especially small businesses, to determine the effects that the law would have on them. And that's anything that creates uncertainty in the business community tends to retard economic growth. That was one effect. Another was very powerful opposition by the Republican Party in Congress to any measures suggested by the Democratic administration. And finally, and looming very large today, is the European economic crisis. European countries, not all of them, but Europe as a whole is having very serious economic problems. Our major exports are to Europe, so anything that hurts the European economy retards American economic growth. And we're big borrowers from China, and we have a lot of business with China. China has a lot of business with Europe. As the European economy grinds down, the Chinese economy is adversely affected, and that affects us adversely. So our economic fortunes are bound up with the rest of the world doing, on the whole, worse than the United States, and that's tending to pull us down. So we have this very slow recovery. There is some recovery, rising housing prices. And of course, rising housing prices means people who own houses feel better off now, worth more. They have larger net worth, so they feel more relaxed about borrowing. Lenders feel they have better security. They can lend more generously, and that should lead to higher consumption and then higher production, more employment. So that's what's happening, but it's very, very slow. There's some concern that this is not just a temporary problem, and that there's a long-run problem which has been sort of exposed by the short-run crash. And the long-run problem is a kind of hollowing out of the labor force. There's the sense that at the top of the labor force, there are tremendous opportunities for very able or very lucky people in industries like, of course, the computer industry with all its ramifications and all its satellite activities, in intellectual property and entertainment and movies and advertising and so on, in advanced pharmaceutical manufacture, in specialized forms of medical treatment, and so on. Lots of opportunities for high IQ, very well-educated people or people with wealthy families. Great opportunities for them. At the bottom, for basic service jobs and manufacturing and, again, construction and working in restaurants and so on, plenty of jobs there. Employment has been growing. But there's a middle sector occupied by people who are, not particularly well educated, but it used to be sort of the good, solid jobs in manufacturing to a significant extent. And a lot of those jobs have disappeared. Some of them have disappeared because of automation, some of them by outsourcing to foreign countries. And this outsourcing now is reaching a point where it's beginning to chip away at the upper middle class. So, for example, there's now a great deal of outsourcing of legal work, especially to India. India has a very large English-speaking population of educated people, and it has a legal system, a common law, English-style legal system, which is quite similar to the American. And yet the wages are very much lower. So law firms and their clients are transferring a lot of work to India, and so are the software and other computer companies. And in addition, of course, a lot of foreign countries like China are beginning to manufacture the type of high-tech goods which the United States had thought it had a real lock on. So it is possible to have a situation in which a country loses, not all of its jobs, obviously, but loses a lot of attractive jobs to foreign countries or to automation. And we see this in a spreading income inequality in the United States. The incomes of the top 1%, 1/10 of 1%, 5% of households have been rising with bumps and so on, but actually have done really well in recent decades. But at the bottom, there's a larger and larger group of people who have either no jobs or they have very low-paying service jobs. And this kind of spread in inequality, which makes people so much different from each other because of their tremendous difference in economic opportunities, that can be very bad for a country in the long run. It can create social tensions, but it can also just create a huge underclass of people who are discouraged and have poor opportunities and eventually become envious and resentful of the top tier, a small group of people who are immensely wealthy. So that's a long-term problem to worry about. And connected with it is kind of, I should say, a medium-term problem, which is that as a result of the economic collapse that began in the fall of 2008, federal tax revenues and also state tax revenues fell. And the result at the state level is a lot of real hardship and having to lay off teachers and firemen and police and so on. At the federal level, it reflects itself in a very large national debt, public debt of the Treasury. And In the short run, because interest rates are extremely low for the Treasury Department, you can actually borrow for 10 years for like 1% a year. But in the long run, a very large debt can become a great weight on a country's prosperity if interest rates rise, if the lenders demand repayment. And there have been countries that actually go bankrupt because of excessive debt. So you have these long-run economic problems. So switching from this sort of macroeconomic picture of how the country has gotten itself into trouble in the last few years, we have a bunch of, and this is moving more toward the political, we have a bunch of systems in the United States, or you could think of the United States as a composite of a whole bunch of systems that have to work with each other. An education system, a justice system, a healthcare system, a legal system, and so on. And a lot of these systems seem to be in trouble all at once, which is surprising and it's disturbing, because there don't seem to be any real solutions on offer, and the political parties seem incapable of working with each other to deal with problems which are so large and contentious that you really need a consensus of the political interest to do anything about them. So one which everyone understands, there's a problem with the education system. The United States still has the greatest universities in the world, but the rest of the below the, and to some extent within the higher education system, there are a lot of very serious problems. Some of them come down simply to extraordinary tuition expense and to a loan system, a federal loan system, extremely unforgiving because it's very difficult to get out of student loans through bankruptcy. There's only a small little escape hatch. So there's at the sort of upper level, the higher education level, there's this tremendous debt problem, tuition problem, $1 trillion in federal debt for higher education. And below that, in secondary and primary education, tremendous concerns with the quality of the education, quality of teaching, incentives, and ambitions of kids, and so on. So that's a very large problem. There are now a number of countries whose kids perform better on various tests, maybe math and science, vocabulary, and so on, which are given all over the world as a way of comparing countries. So we're sliding behind a number of other countries that have better education for their people. We have two great professions, medicine and law, which are sort of abandoning the professional model of service provision in favor of a business model. So the professional model, typically for doctors and for lawyers, was one in which there were limits, formal or informal, or ethical or customary, on the vigor of competition between professionals. And in exchange for this relaxation of competition, you didn't have to worry about losing all your business, all your patients to competitors. There was an understanding that the fees charged by professionals would be adequate for a nice upper middle class income, but they wouldn't make you a wealthy person, with very rare exceptions. In a business model, you don't have limitations on competition, and you invariably have a very great spread in incomes as the more aggressive, abler people come to dominate, and the others become employees and are paid much less, and so on. We're seeing this particularly in law, making law much more Darwinian type of activity with very steep gradient of wages between partners at the top and the lawyers at the bottom, where most partners are service partners who are really salaried. Few people at the top have huge incomes. And in medicine, we see higher and higher percentage of doctors going into becoming specialists, where they can make a lot of money doing a lot of procedures. And the generalists are in shortage in many parts of the country, even though they seem to be more valuable in terms of keeping people generally healthy. We have a healthcare system that's the most expensive in the world, but doesn't seem to produce better or even as good outcomes in terms of longevity or general health and vigor as countries that spend significantly less on health care. So that's a problem. It seems connected to the tax exemption of health benefits provided by employers, which encourage overuse of medical care. So that's a serious problem. That connects to another system failure, which is our tax system, that seems to be a ramshackle mess. And in addition to this tax exemption for employer-provided health benefits, there's the mortgage interest tax deduction, which of course encourages buying houses and helps to finance housing bubbles. We have a criminal justice system that seems to be profoundly malfunctioning. So we have about 1% of the American population is in a jail or in a prison. And this is between 4 and 7 times the per capita imprisonment rate of the countries we compare ourselves with, the other wealthy countries, European, Canada, and so on. So much of this has to do with our drug laws, but something is wrong. There should not be this enormous rate of incarceration, or if there is, at least we ought to have really low crime rates. All the criminals are in prison, but no, we have high crime rates, especially murder rates. So we seem to have a high level of violence coexisting with an extremely severe criminal justice system that imprisons a dramatically high percentage of the population, and very expensively. Very expensive to maintain people in prison who could be productive on the outside. We have a very serious immigration problem. We have apparently about 11 million illegal immigrants. There's no question of removing the illegal immigrants. They're approximately 8% of the American workforce. You can't remove 8% of your workers. I mean, that's just ridiculous. So we have these people living in a kind of twilight zone because of their illegality. At the same time that we have all these millions of immigrants, we're actually losing opportunities to enrich the country with a lot of other immigrants who are not just, people who are going to do low-level agricultural other work, but people, many of them from East Asia, who are well-educated and middle-class people, come here, make a big contribution. But of course, Americans worry about the competition that immigrant labor will provide for jobs that Americans want. Now, with the illegal immigrants who do agricultural work in the United States, most Americans don't want to do that work, so they are welcome despite their illegality. And finally, we have some long-term systemic problems that we don't seem able to deal with. One is a deteriorating infrastructure, terrible roads, airports, and so on, bridges, so forth. And finally, there really is a serious problem of climate control. There are a lot of efforts to dismiss global warming as some kind of myth or something invented by people who hate automobiles and what have you. But no, carbon emissions, according to the best scientific evidence, have increased significantly over the recent decades, continuing to increase, and they may or may not be causing current climate changes, but if the increase continues, and there's nothing to stop it, then eventually we can have really catastrophic consequences. And we're not doing anything about this. So the problem is all of these systemic failures, education, the professions, healthcare, infrastructure, environmental problems like climate control, they're all soluble one way or another, but they're all the methods of solving them are very controversial, and that's why you need the parties to be working together. But what's happened is that, as we all know, increasing political polarization. If you think back 10, 20, 30, 40 years, the parties used to be a good deal more similar to each other. There were times when this wasn't true, when they tended to spread apart. But generally, they have been very similar. There was an article recently about how much liberal legislation was enacted during the Nixon administration. And I have long thought that the Clinton administration really was kind of the consolidation of the Reagan revolution. The Democrats adopted many of the approaches, the attitudes of the Reagan administration, much friendlier to business, for example. And both the first Bush, Bush's father, and the second Bush, the current Bush, with his 2 terms, the 3 Bush terms, the Republicans were actually not that far distant from Democrats. If you think of the Medicare drug bill that the second Bush adopted, and his general attitude, or his slogan of compassionate conservatism, there was an effort to soften the rough edges of the different parties and make them more alike. That was certainly something that President Obama made a theme of his administration, although without a great deal of success. Now the parties seem really at each other's throats, and this makes it extremely difficult to deal with these problems that we have. So, not to end on a gloomy note, there are many strong features of the American system. We do have the greatest military in the world. We do spend as much on military defense as the whole rest of the world combined, which I think is great. And we have, really good national security apparatus going beyond the military in terms of how we've dealt with terrorism and how our intelligence agencies have performed. So we're doing well, and I think foreign policy has done well for the United States. We deal with some really difficult countries, but I think doing as well as we can and able to control the situation to the extent of protecting our security. Country still has tremendous innovative capabilities and tremendous industries, not just the software and the entertainment, but, manufacture of aircraft. Automobile manufacturing now has come back. Pharmaceutical drugs, that's a tremendous American industry. So, and it's the greatest economy, and it's the biggest economy in the world, most successful. And in fact, despite all the concerns about the economic health of the United States, it has been doing better than almost every other country in the world in coping with the worldwide economic crisis that began 4 years ago. So the country has, the potential and resources to overcome its serious problems, but the political system is not cooperating with providing the solutions that we need. So I'll stop here and happy to entertain questions or comments. Thank you.
Judge Posner, please come to the aisles.
Yes, Judge Posner, I wanted to ask you a follow-up on your point about the overcrowding in prison. It strikes me that in a lot of ways, we've heard a lot of prosecutors now coming up with unique applications of certain acts. RICO, of course, being a big one from years back, and basically looking at ways to find people, to charge people with crimes that weren't really crimes, or that they couldn't have known were crimes, they were not predictable. And it seems to me that it's up to the judges, in some sense, to rein that in. Certainly legislation would be appropriate, but in a number of cases, it seems to me that it's out of control from the prosecutor's standpoint, and the prosecutors are never called, never taken to task. I'd just like to hear what your feelings are on that.
I think the problem is that the prosecutors really have all the tools. So one of the bizarre features of our system, and I'm primarily familiar with the federal criminal system, although we do get state criminal cases through habeas corpus. But there are more than 4,000 separate federal criminal prohibitions. And it's very easy in a vast number of cases for a prosecutor dipping into this vast menu of possible criminal prohibitions to charge people. And there's a tendency, although we have a sort of nominal rule that criminal laws are supposed to be precise and doubts to be resolved against conviction. But in fact, the tendency is to draft criminal prohibitions broadly in order to avoid loopholes. So you have these 4,000 prohibitions. Many of them are very broad. And the penalties for federal criminal crimes tend to be very severe, and there's no parole. So it gives a prosecutor a lot of leeway in being able to charge a person with a lot of vaguely defined crimes, and the person knowing that if he's convicted, he could face a very, very severe sentence. And this arms the prosecutor to negotiate an advantageous guilty plea agreement, so the defendant has a lower term, but the prosecutor has a kind of easy victory because he didn't have to go to trial. So, and of course, federal government has tremendous resources. So, I'm not troubled particularly about the risk of convicting innocent people. It does happen, but I think it's quite rare. I think the problem is that there are too many of these criminal prohibitions. The sentences are too severe, and it's too easy with the plea bargaining process to grind out a tremendous number of convictions. This is just on the federal level. Now, of course, most of the prisoners are state, but I think similar forces are operating in the state system. Personally, I don't think we should have a fraction of the drug laws that we have. I think it's really absurd to be criminalizing possession or use or distribution of marijuana. I can't see any difference between that and cigarettes. But also, I'm skeptical about the other drug laws. I don't know how much we know, for example, about whether cocaine is really a disabling drug or whether it's something people can take and lead more or less normal lives. Clearly there are, like LSD, obviously very dangerous drug, although I don't think we have a good idea as how many people really, jump out of windows because they're taking LSD. And there's the abuse of the prescription drugs and so on. There are problems, but I think the notion of using the criminal law as the primary means of dealing with a problem of addiction, of misuse, of ingesting dangerous drugs, I don't think that. I don't think that's sensible at all, and that is responsible for a high percentage of our prisoners. And these punishments are often very, very severe. And through things, like the Armed Career Criminal Act and career offender guidelines and other ways of punishing people on the basis of previous convictions that they have, you can have relatively minor crimes generate huge sentences. And it's all very expensive, and it's a waste of a lot of high-quality legal mind, but it's also a waste of a lot of people's lives who could be at least moderately productive without having to spend year after year in prison. So that is a serious problem. I think also the criminal procedure has become immensely complicated. And the prosecutors have proved very adept, I think, at turning procedures that were designed by perhaps naive judges for the sake of defendants into tools for prosecution. That seems to be the result of the Miranda rule. So before there was a Miranda rule, courts would worry about coerced confessions, protracted questioning, and sort of depriving people, not depriving people, or, well, I guess mostly protracted questioning, not really third-degree stuff, but very ways in which police have wearing people's resistance down to confessing or making incriminating comments. But it turns out that with the Miranda rule, now the courts tend just to ask, was the Miranda warning given? If it was, and the person agreed to talk, then they don't worry about what happens later. Although when you look closely, often you find what happened later was actually quite coercive. So, and of course, the basic futility of the courts trying to create new rights for criminal defendants is that this can always be offset by a legislature just raising the sentences, because then maybe because of the rights, fewer innocent people are convicted, but those who are serve heavier sentences. So I think fundamental legislative reform is necessary. I don't think it's something that the courts are able to do.
Hello, I'm Nick Baldwin, and you lightly touched on immigration, but I was wondering if you thought that with NAFTA and the North American Free Trade Agreement, if that wasn't kind of forcing immigrants to a different place and really destroying the economy in Mexico, and then creating a place where they can only move to immigrate to America, and with our immigration system being so messed up that the only option is to become an illegal immigrant in America.
No, wait, I missed the first part of it. Your only choice to be illegal immigrant because of conditions in Mexico?
The North American Free Trade Agreement.
Oh, because of NAFTA? Why that?
Because NAFTA promotes dumping in Mexico that has taken a lot of part of the agricultural economy in Mexico out of the question, and when it's a largely agricultural-based economy, and you destroy that, and then would you think that forces illegal immigrants with the only choice to become illegal immigrants in America?
Yeah, well, I wasn't aware of that effect of the NAFTA agreement, but there's no question that anything that happens to depress economic conditions in Mexico increases the incentive of Mexicans to come to the United States. In fact, there's a rule of thumb that when the average income of a country reaches 40% of the American level, you cease to have significant immigration from that country. You just have immigration at the professional level, but you don't have immigration from ordinary working class people. So it is in our, if we want to limit the number of immigrants, it is in our interest to help the Mexican economy. Now, actually, of course, the other side of this is anything that depresses our economy depresses immigration to the United States, and that's happened. There has been less immigration from Mexico since our economic collapse. And Mexico, although we read about the terrible criminal activities there, Mexico has been doing well economically in recent years, partly because they have oil resources. So Mexico doing a little better despite the crime, United States doing worse, so immigration is down. But I must say, I'm not terribly troubled by the immigration. As long as people are coming here to work and there's demand for their labor and Americans don't want those jobs, I don't see a serious problem.
Good evening, Judge Posner. Thank you very much for your remarks tonight. I had a question about the economic crises that you spoke about, the lost wealth, trillions of dollars in mortgage foreclosures, the student loan crises, $1 trillion of debt, credit cards, 800 billion people with medical problems maxing out their cards. I look at these and I see a fine print contract with lots of terms that consumers have not read. You yourself in another forum talked about that recently. And I would like to know, what do you think could be done to help what I consider a failed regulatory paradigm of disclosure, to reform some of these fine print contracts so consumers know what they're getting into when they buy a house or have APRs on their credit cards and whatnot. And second, you also mentioned some of the crises in the political system that two major parties being alike and now less alike. What do you think could be done to make it easier for third parties and independents to compete?
Well, those are two very good questions. Unfortunately, they're unanswerable. So the problem with the consumer contract, with the fine print and so on, the problem is that one of the areas where there has been tremendous but perverse intellectual growth is marketing. And modern marketing technique, utilizing psychological principles for manipulation, are very powerful. The analogy that comes to mind is that I think it's the Ralston Company. It's a major manufacturer of cat food, and they have a farm in Oregon or somewhere, and they have hundreds of cats. And they tinker with their recipe and always looking for the recipe which will make the food more irresistible to the cat, so that the cat, will be torturing its owners to give it more of the food. And I think that's what marketers do on a subtler scale with consumers. They know what to say that makes their product irresistible. And it's not at all clear to me what solution there is. I don't think disclosure is a solution. Disclosure of ingredients and this and that. And the problem is that people get simply swamped with disclosure, and then they just tune out. We were asked, my wife and I were asked by our bank shortly after the crash of September 2008, whether we'd like to increase our home equity credit line. And we didn't particularly want to, but very low interest rate. And it's just a credit, it's just a line of credit. You don't have to actually borrow it. So we went over to the bank, and in order to agree to this, we had to sign this incredible sheath of disclosures. And I don't think either of us read it. We figured, well, it was a line of credit, so they could terminate it, they could stop it. We'd have to repay if we borrowed. So we figured, you know, so we didn't look at it. And I think it's true, you know, how many people really know what to do with all the ingredient disclosures on packages? If you have some allergy or something, it's fine. Otherwise, if you're trying to reduce the amount of sodium you consume, well, you'd have to be a real student of nutrition in order to make sense. So I don't think there's there's much that can be done. I'm sorry, but I've forgotten your second question. Oh, the third part. Well, you know, yeah, my answer is very similar. The problem with the third party is that how do you? Well, it's a little like the problem of, you know, when you have debates among presidential contenders, then the question is, whom do you have to let in? We do have third, fourth, fifth, nth parties, but then there's the sense that, well, if they're really small, then if you let them into the candidates' debate, then there's too much cacophony and people get confused and so on. And then there are these ballot prerequisites. You can't get onto the ballot unless you have X% of the votes at the last election. Well, how do you get to the vote? Should the government give you money so that you have a chance to compete with the parties in order to get enough votes so that you can be on the ballot next time? Very difficult to see how that works. So we've I guess the last successful third party is probably the Republicans in the 1850s. They just, and occasionally parties rise up. There have been candidates like Anderson and, I don't know, it was 1980 or whenever it was, or 90, or 88 or something, who actually had a significant vote. But it never led to a party. So it seems that the American political culture is just very inimical to third parties. And to encourage third parties would require some kind of social engineering that we don't know how to do well. And I think the two-party system traditionally had the following great strength, which is that because there are only two parties, and because there's a great diversity of political views in the country, each party tended to be a coalition, and often quite a range of liberal to conservative. And that made for overlap, which facilitated compromise. It's only occasional periods on our history, and of course the present, that we've had parties that are very polarized, that have a lot of internal discipline and insist on people towing the party line, and then you have difficulty compromising because you don't have overlapping membership in terms of political outlooks. But again, not at all apparent to me what you can do about it. And I think it's the result of two things, of the 9/11 attacks and the economic crash. These are two very disturbing events for people and kind of dislocates them from their ordinary loyalties and beliefs. And of course, the other factor which fosters extremism of all sorts is the internet, because people had really eccentric views that they were embarrassed to voice, thinking they were the only people who could think such a thing. They discover that there are hundreds, thousands of others, and they form a community. And we heard a recent case involving a neo-Nazi group, and it turns out that there are thousands of what are called hate groups. They're not all Nazi, but groups that, most of them harmless, but full of violent and crazy beliefs. But they egg each other on. Once you discover that there are a lot of people, even in percentage of the population, very minute, but you discover other people, you have these chat rooms with other people and egging each other on, and that builds a kind of solidarity and confidence in your extreme beliefs. And I think that helps to explain our political polarization.
Is the lack of economic education the reason that many people thought they could use their homes as a piggy bank instead of saving money?
It depends what you mean by economic education. I don't think that education in economic principles would do much, since the economists, on the whole, did not see this coming. So, but I think what you're talking about, which I think is important, is that people ought to be taught the fundamentals of sort of household management, of savings and expenditure and risk. So we have cases from time to time involving con men, Ponzi schemes, and the like. And it's obvious that the people who fall victim to these con artists are, for the most part, people who are simply extremely naive about how the economy, in the sense of your day-to-day dealings with other people and products and so on, work. And you know, a lot of people, someone comes and says, well, if you invest with me, I'll pay you 50% a year dividend. They say, wow, that's terrific. And they invest, of course, it's a con artist. People seem to have really tremendous difficulty in dealing with interest as a concept and with percentages as a measure of an interest rate. And, you know, these payday loans and also the car title loans, they charge extraordinary rates of interest. And this I mean, they'll offer, it could be 300% a year. Now, because of the Truth in Lending Act, this gets back to the point about the efficacy of disclosure requirements. The annual percentage interest rate is clearly disclosed. But apparently most people, for many people, an interest rate has no meaning. And they just ask, what am I going to pay per month? And if they figure, well, that's not too much to pay per month, you know, for a few months. But they do it for this, and they do it for that, and they do it for the other thing. Next thing they know, you know, they're way underwater. So I think, now, maybe, I don't know, but maybe high schools, some high schools try to do this. But I think, yes, just personal financial management would be a very useful skill for everybody to acquire.
Hey, please support. Sorry, wrong venue. I have got to sit before Your Honor, but somebody assumed they knew well. Graduate of Elmhurst College. My name is Brian Brewer. I've been practicing now for about 11 years. I came out of law school. I was settled in some heavy debt. Your Honor touched a little bit today on the student loan aspect of how the economy is having its problems. And the past couple of days, some things have been said. Specifically last week, and taking a look at something President Clinton said during one of his speeches at the Democratic National Convention, got me to thinking a little bit about my own situation and why I find myself where I am. And I've come to a conclusion, maybe for rightly or wrongly, that there seems to have been that's why I put it as a culture of borrow your way into prosperity and work out in the end.
Right.
I have to say that Elmhurst College was not part of that. It was law school that did that to me. My question for you would be, Judge, would be, as an observer, did you ever see that culture blossom, and if so, when? And now do you see anybody backing off of that, or is it still in full force effect?
Now that's a great question. When I went to college, because it's a long time ago, graduated in 1959, but when I went to college, there was no such thing as student loans. Tuition, even at fancy schools, was much lower, even in inflation-adjusted terms, was much lower than it is now. And generally, your family paid, but if you couldn't afford to, then the school gave you a scholarship and no loans. Now, sometimes if you got a scholarship, you had to wait on tables. I remember that from Yale College, but there weren't loans, so no one came out with debt. And in law school, again, the tuition was low, and I don't think anyone borrowed. And at some point, as you say, people got it in their heads that you could borrow your way to prosperity. Now, it's a kind of extension, a kind of imaginative but reckless extension of ordinary sort of business thinking, where borrowing is very, very important to get started. But of course, for personal borrowing, it creates a level of risk that a business doesn't have. And even a business that's operated by risk takers, they borrow money and they go broke, well, a business bankruptcy, you walk away from, you don't have any continuing obligation. Of course, with the federal student loan guarantee, it's almost impossible to declare bankruptcy. So I do think that maybe beginning in the late 90s, certainly in the early 2000s, there was this sense of endless economic expansion. If you know that values are going to be rising, salaries are going to be rising, and so on, then it makes perfectly good sense to borrow. But that can become a national mood, and people are fooled and get into serious trouble. I do think the schools are, to an extent, at fault, maybe to a very big extent, in the same way that consumer producers are, who hire these psychologically sophisticated marketing firms. I think schools have often not warned students about the risks of debt and about the uncertainty of the job market that they may be entering. So that's, as I said, the medicine and law are examples where a professional model of service provision gives way to a business model, which is rapacious and highly competitive. And we've seen a lot of this with higher education. A number of the scandals involving athletics and so on at various schools are driven by the business model or business-like model of colleges. They're nominally state, they're nominally nonprofit, although there are now a lot of profit colleges, but functionally, in the way their executives feel, they're in a competitive market. They'll pay a coach $500,000 a year if they think that he will earn his salary in enhanced alumni contributions because of the performance of the football team, and will admit people as football players who shouldn't be in school but who are great players. and they'll help to generate alumni loyalty, translates into donations and this and that. So if you have that kind of attitude on the part of providers of education or any other service, it's going to hurt. It's going to hurt a lot of people. It's very unfortunate.
Good evening. I'd like to thank you for spending your time with us tonight, and Elmhurst College for offering this forum for these many years. I'm a public librarian, and as such, I want you to know that people are using public libraries more than ever, even though we just don't count our success in the circulation of books. But my concern tonight is that we're here and we're in the middle of a political presidential campaign, and this is the first presidential campaign that we've been exposed to since the Supreme Court ruling on what constitutes free speech. The federal government, at the federal level, we have a broken political system, and the same holds true in the state, not just the state of Illinois. So I just would like some of your comments about the Supreme Court ruling, how it's affecting the political climate, and
I'm not sure what the question was, though. Question?
Supreme Court ruling on the speech in terms of what corporations are able to spend in political campaigns.
You mean the Citizens United?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, the Citizens United case held that although it's constitutional to regulate donations to campaigns, you cannot limit expenditures during an election that are made by a group that's independent in the sense of not being coordinated with or affiliated with a political party. And that invited a large increase in the amount of money being spent on political campaigns. And even though affiliation is forbidden, nevertheless, there are interest groups, donors, wealthy people, and so on, who have a very clear desire for one party or the other to win. And so the ads they pay for promote that party, that candidate, and so on. So we now have a higher level of campaign expenditures. And what the effects are, nobody knows really. I think this is the first presidential election since the Citizens United decision. There's some sense that maybe it's not going to make a great deal of difference because maybe they're just, diminishing marginal effect of expenditures that people, after a while, they tune out of these ads. So we'll see. I don't think of it as a very healthy development. I think it would be fine to limit campaign contributions, as is done in other countries. We've gotten to the point where the presidential campaign is really 2 years long. And that means a lot of distraction of people, candidates, the parties, the Congress, the president, and so on, worrying sort of half the time, worrying as much about political competition as about the problems of the country. So I think that is a problem. What we can do about it, I guess we won't do anything about it. I don't know what we could do.
This will be your last question.
Good evening, Judge. I was last in the room with you 34 years ago, and I was fortunate enough to sit in on one of your torts classes.
Wow.
Learning in law school. But I was wondering if you could just briefly comment on the state of the federal judiciary, where it seems that we have the judicial appointments process getting caught in the meat grinder of partisan politics. There are a large number of judicial vacancies. We see district judges on panels by designation and senior judges being called in because of vacancies. And this is at a time when more and more law seems to be becoming federalized. I was wondering, what is the state of the federal judiciary?
Well, I mean, I think Judge Bauer would agree, may have his own view, but I think we, the Seventh Circuit, our little Court of Appeals, we are quite fortunate because we have relatively light caseload. We have one vacancy, but we have 4 senior judges. So reach the age of 65 with 15 years of service or 70 with 10 years, you can, while retaining staff and salary, you can take a reduced load and you continue to sit and you're part of the court. And we have 4 senior judges, and one of them, Judge Bauer, takes 100% load. So that's the equivalent of our having our full 11 judges instead of 10. So we have a nominal vacancy, but we really don't have a vacancy. So we have Bill, and then we have several judges who do sit part-time. So we at the Court of Appeals level are okay, and I don't think there are a great many district court vacancies in our circuit. So I think our circuit is okay, but the situation for the country as a whole is that there are a lot of judicial vacancies. They're harder to fill, both as a matter of time, but also as a matter of finding people willing to go through what has become a real meat grinder process. In the olden days, when I became a judge, and I'm sure even more so when Judge Bauer did, you had to fill out some forms, and you had to have an interview with the American Bar Association. You had to have a Senate confirmation hearing, but it was relatively innocuous. Now it's very taxing, very straining on people, and that discourages people. The salary has been frozen for a number of years, so it's still a pretty good salary. But it's not a great salary for people who are really successful practicing lawyers. And the problem is not so much that the caseload is increasing. It is increasing, but it hasn't increased as rapidly as it was increasing in the 60s and 70s. But the problem is that the cases are actually becoming more complex. It's part of the general technological rapid advance. So I think we're feeling that enhanced complexity, but we're not getting any additional assistance in dealing with it. I don't think we can go on indefinitely with such difficulty in filling vacancies and with mounting vacancies and with the frozen salary. In addition, Congress is cutting the overall judicial budget significantly, and there are various ways in which government agencies can reduce expenditures, not too painfully. But after a while, you get into really serious problems of trying to keep your operation going with an inadequate salary. So I think it is something to worry about. It doesn't seem to be something that concerns anybody, however, with all the other problems that are pressing on the country, so I don't expect relief soon, but I hope people would understand it is a problem.
Thank you, Judge Posner, for coming to Elmhurst College and joining us this evening. Your presentation, The Crisis of Capitalist Democracy, was both interesting and informative. Well, I don't know if I want to graduate in February anymore, but I'm glad I got this opportunity to really face the problems that need to be addressed in America, especially considering that it's an election year. So I would like to present you with this gift on behalf of Elmhurst College.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Let's all give him a round of applause. My name is Katie Hardison, and I'm the class of 2013 and president of Elmhurst College Delta Mu Delta Business Honor Society. I would like to thank all of you for joining us this evening and encourage you to attend other upcoming Elmhurst College events, which include next Thursday, September 13th at 7 p.m., Mathematician and computer scientist Dr. Maria Klawe will present Giving Women the Access Code. Dr. Klawe became president of Harvey Mudd College in 2006 and was dismayed to find that the percentage of female computer science graduates at her institution was stuck in the single digits. She turned that around dramatically. In 2012, about 40% of Harvey Mudd's computer science degrees went to women. Her experience sheds light on a field that remains stubbornly male-dominated. On Thursday, September 20th at 7 p.m., Jerry Reinsdorf, attorney, certified public accountant, and the majority owner of the Chicago Bulls and the Chicago White Sox, will present the economic of sports and of the real world. His teams have delivered 7 world championship titles to the city and its impassioned fans. Few Americans are better acquainted with the peculiar economic realities of this high-profile industry. On Sunday, September 23rd at 7 p.m., Rebecca Skloot will present The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks. Henrietta Lacks was a poor tobacco farmer, the mother of 5, and 31 years old when she died of cancer on October 4th, 1951. Before she was buried, researchers at Johns Hopkins harvested some of the cancer cells that had killed her. For half a century, scientists and biotechnology companies used the cells to develop countless medical breakthroughs. Neither Mrs. Lacks nor the family she left behind were asked about allowing her tissue to be used for research. Miss Skloot's best-selling book about Henrietta Lacks is at once a family drama and a remarkable medical history. And on Thursday, September 27th, Roy F. Baumeister, social psychologist, through ingenious experiments, discovered that the will, like a muscle, can grow tired, be invigorated by a sugar fix, and even be toned and strengthened by purposeful exercise. The Harvard psychologist Steven Pinker calls Mr. Baumeister's book Willpower immensely rewarding, filled with wise advice and insightful reflections on the human condition. For more information, please visit our website at www.elmhurst.edu. Again, thank you all for joining us, and please have a safe trip home.